Welcome to the 11th instalment of Guido Talks. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, you don't have to look at us in our dreadful lockdown hair. You can actually go onto any of your favourite podcast platforms and listen to this as an audio podcast as well. My name's Tom Harwood, and once again I'm joined by the founder and editor of Guido Talks, Paul Staines, along with reporter Christian Calgi. Thank you for joining us. In fact, today you might notice our backgrounds are a little bit different. We're trying something slightly new. We are in our socially distanced office in the heart of Westminster. So we're more able now to get out and about, picking up our stories all back to work safely. So, my favourite piece of news this week, and I think probably everyone in this office's favourite piece of news this week, came on Thursday evening. And it was the accumulation of a lot of years of campaigning from this website in a very satisfying way. I wonder if, Paul, you could explain what this story is.
Well, as you said, late on Thursday night, I got a text message from Downing Street sources, as they're known, and it began, "You win." And I went, what's this? And there was a long explanation that as of the autumn, Downing Street will be televising the afternoon briefings, which are to lobby journalists and ourselves, because we're not members of the lobby. And for years, I've seen the lobby system where the journalists hunt as a pack and get the line out that they want to get out. They mediate the line. Instead of us hearing the question and getting the answer and the viewers seeing for ourselves, the lobby mediates it and they put their own interpretation in it. So rather than getting a second-hand version of the Tory through the filter of the lobby journalist's personal take on matters, we will now be able to see the answer for ourselves. This happens all over the world. It's not something that's unusual. It's not something that's exclusive to America, that we see the press briefings from the White House regularly. It's something that the lobby has resisted for a long time, and I think the reason they've resisted it is a little bit of the magic goes, and they don't want us to realise that half the time they're just taking dictation and using their shorthand skills to report what they've been told. I think the big difference this will make is that the government will be able to directly reach voters in a way that they've tried to do with social media. We had Boris's PMQs, where he had questions on Facebook to people. To be honest, journalists do know their subject and do have a better take for what the next story is going to be. So it's useful to have professionals asking the question. And now we can listen and see the answers ourselves without having to put up with the individual journalists doing their own unique interpretation. And it's sometimes noticeable that two journalists hearing the same answer will report it completely different. Now we'll be able to judge for ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting and interesting and good change, and it's something that we have been very vocally campaigning for a very long time, so it's very, very satisfying. But also it's quite interesting seeing some of the people more resistant to change, more resistant to progress within the lobby system, saying that this is somehow, or alleging that this is somehow a power grab from the government, which I just find hilarious, because of course it wasn't so long ago that across the pond in the United States, when the Trump administration stopped doing the press briefings, all the journalists over there were saying that's a power grab, and not having televised press briefings is somehow an evil or fascistic thing to do. And on this side of the pond, it's completely reversed. So I think very quickly we're going to see a lot of that resistance that was there melt away. We've already seen it with certain journalists who were incredibly rude to some members of our staff when we've been along to these briefings before, and agitated for them to be broadcast out to people rather than through the filter of the journalists' pens. And this is it's one of those moments where, something so obviously should have happened. Once it has happened, I think there'll be very, very few people agitating for it to go back to the way it was. Okay, well, unless you want to add anything there, Calgi, about your experiences in the room.
I think it's quite hilarious to see some of these Damascene conversions by senior members of the lobby who are now, a couple of them, supporting the move. I think we've had Tom Newton-Dunn particularly saying that it's a good move, and I don't particularly remember any members of the lobby publicly coming forward back in January and February when we were attempting to shake things up and live streaming via our Twitter account, but no grudges held. I'm always happy to see a convert, but I was quite shocked by it because the soundings I'd had was that the Prime Minister's spokesman wasn't really keen on the idea, but it's a great victory, and all those ranting and raving lobby journalists who were attacking me earlier in the year as I went into Number 9 Downing Street and live tweeted, I think are finally going to realise that Guido were very much on the right side of history with this argument and this change.
There's always an opportunity for Tom Newton-Dunn to switch sides. Now he's on the radio. He's an accomplished broadcaster, I suppose, and Downing Street have said they do want to get a broadcaster. It will be a political appointee, and he could switch sides and become the Prime Minister's spokesman. I mean,
perhaps in a similar vein, Ross Kempsell might be heading straight back to Downing Street.
Ross can't go back; he's only just left.
The one-man revolving door of.
Oh no, it is quite fun speculating as to who's going to get that job. I think we were going to write a piece about it, and then we realised we're really fishing in the dark, because I don't think even Downing Street know at this point who they want to do.
No, although they have seemingly ruled out Richard Madeley. It's the one, for some reason, was the name specifically brought up in today's lobby briefing.
Also, a lot of the senior journalists are on, serious money, and it's going to be a bit odd having a spokesman who's paid twice as much as the Prime Minister, possibly. So. Who they're going to recruit is going to be fascinating, because you have to be able to think on your feet, and it's not going to be an easy job to face up to the lobby's finest in their most ferocious mode when you've got to make the government's case.
It's also going to be very interesting because if you sit through the normal lobby briefing, it's not immediately something you'd think of as a great candidate for TV. Because the spokesperson has to choose every word incredibly carefully, so things aren't misinterpreted and things aren't given in falsehood. And it's quite stuttery and slow. So yeah, it's going to be you're going to have a heck of a skill set in order to pull it off, really.
I'm hoping there are going to be proper presentations as well. I'm just remembering back to when Sean Spicer was the press secretary in the White House and had all these photos of crowd sizes and was sort of alleging that Donald Trump's inauguration was the most watched thing. And of course, over the last 4 years in the US, it's such a demanding job that there have been so many different people doing it. You started out with Sean Spicer, you had Sarah Huckabee Sanders, you had whoever the woman is doing it now. I mean, clearly it's very demanding and sometimes can be the source of great entertainment, as well as information. And of course, just looking at it from a sort of cultural side, at the moment there are laws preventing the use of footage from the House of Commons in comedy shows, for example, whereas footage from this sort of press briefing would be, I think, far more disseminated and can really shine a light through cultural avenues that don't normally see what's going on in politics. So I think it's quite an exciting step forward.
It could be a complete turn-off. I think towards the end of all the coronavirus briefings, we were getting quite bored with Peston's 5-minute monologues of questions. And there are a lot of egos in the lobby, a lot of very thin-skinned egos. So I think there's going to be some grandstanding, particularly from the broadcast journalists. I mean, if Jon Snow's back in there, he'll be campaigning for whatever his hobby horse is. There's not a lot of people who are afraid of taking the limelight in the lobby. So it could be the worst television you can imagine. And as somebody's been to a lot of political press conferences, they're not always that interesting. So I think edited highlights are going to be few and far between.
Well, moving on from what was probably the most consequential for us story of the week, there was actually another story this week that was incredibly consequential with regard to geopolitics, and something that was really quite bold and big from this government, and that was the offer to those British national overseas passport holders and their dependents in Hong Kong, 2.9 million of them, to be able to escape the encroaching communist tyranny that's moving in to that city. Paul, can you explain a little bit more about this story for those who haven't been following?
Well, the idea of giving the British nationals overseas full visa rights has been around since before 1997, when the treaty, the 50 years came to an end and the handover was going to be in play. I think the Adam Smith Institute, as long as I can remember, has always suggested that having a lot of entrepreneurial, reasonably wealthy Hong Kongers come to Britain would be a net plus. And I think Pretty was keen on it. I think Boris saw the moral case. And my understanding is there was not unanimity in Cabinet when it was proposed, but it has been driven through. And as a result, I don't envisage 3 million Hong Kongers coming. It doesn't. The offer isn't to all Hong Kong citizens; it's to people born before 1997. And to be honest, a lot of them would rather stay in the region and would prefer to go to Taiwan. But if 100,000 Hong Kongers should come over here and maybe go to one of our soon-to-be-open free ports and recreate Hong Kong, wherever it is in the country, it will be a fantastic boost to us.
I've been really interested in an idea proposed by Sam Bowman, who is still, I think, on the advisory board of the ASI, although his day job is now with a different think tank. And he's been proposing that we can take an area of the UK that's, I think, 4 by 4 square miles, which really is not big compared to the size of the UK, and perhaps in one of these new free ports in a place that's sort of post-industrial, that's coastal, that needs regeneration, and give it different planning laws than the rest of the country, and allow these skyscrapers to zoom up, providing housing not just for Hong Kongers that come over to the UK, but also young people in the UK who are in need of housing here as well. And so building that new sort of counterweight to London with enormous new skyscrapers and economic opportunity is a really, really exciting prospect for me. Now, of course, the government hasn't committed to this, but it's an idea that's being discussed, and I'd love to see it progress more.
I love that your idea involves sending 3 million Hong Kongers to Clacton or something like that. I'm sure they'd fit in really well before this regeneration went ahead.
No, it's got to be further north. Clacton, I think, is a bit too kind of clay-based. All the Thames Estuary, like, I was looking at it, I got really interested in this idea, right? And I was looking at the sort of soil types, not just soil types, but sort of the geology of the UK. Because, of course, New York is brilliant for skyscrapers because it's built on hard rock. London is less good because it's built on clay. But actually, a lot of the northeast has really good groundwork for this sort of stuff. So somewhere like Redcar, where of course you're not going to be tearing down any green fields or trees, you've got a lot of sort of post-industrial land there. It could be a really exciting regeneration prospect.
It's my favourite section of our weekly podcast where we talk about the soil types of various parts of the UK.
Yeah, no, because it takes me back to geography.
On solid ground, so to speak.
Disclaimer: I'm not a geologist, although geology rocks. That's your dad joke for the week. Right. Well, it's sort of linked tangentially to this whole B&O offer and quite strong stance that this government is taking against the Communist Party of China, is also the idea that is being floated a lot, particularly this week, that the government is going to row back from its sort of half committal over the Chinese company Huawei being significantly involved in constructing the 5G network of the United Kingdom. Now, I spoke to a few people who are close to government, and I can't find one person who thinks that the plan as it was originally constituted will be moving on in that same way. There's going to be some sort of change. Now, obviously, that's not going to come immediately, and it's almost fortunate that the coronavirus crisis has bought some time here, because a lot of the reason why Huawei was chosen in the first place is because a lot of Western companies really were caught with their trousers down, didn't really have the time, couldn't construct something in the speed that was needed. But perhaps we're going to see a greater pluralism with regard to our telecom infrastructure going forward. And so that's something that's come off the back not only of the Chinese Communist Party government's cover-up over coronavirus right at the beginning of the year, but also their almost annexation of Hong Kong that's going on right now. So whilst horrible things are happening in that part of the world, the reaction from this part of the world, and specifically the reaction from Britain, has, in my view, been quite encouraging. But moving on from foreign policy, we have had a significant resignation at the start of this week. I think it was on Saturday, actually. But Calgi, I think you reported this. Can you tell us more about Mark Sedwill?
Yeah, well, Mark Sedwill is gone. It has left number 10. I think it actually happened on Sunday afternoon. He was expected to resign on Monday, but I think Sebastian Payne of the Financial Times brought forward a premature resignation after an article in that morning, and was replaced by David Frost, who I accidentally called Sir David Frost earlier in the week. Apparently he's not yet had that honour. And he's obviously moved over from the Europe advisor
just to hold you there, David Frost is still the chief Brexit negotiator, but he is going to be taking on the security advisor element of Mark Sedwill's role. So there is still a recruitment process for the next person who's taking on all of the other responsibilities, and they're going to be taking someone who has already been a very senior civil servant for that role.
But obviously one person wasn't very happy with the move, Tom.
Oh yes, no, of course. This was your great idol, Calgi, Theresa May, who when there was an urgent question being answered by the consummate parliamentary performer Michael Gove in the House of Commons, a surprising contribution perhaps was made by Theresa May, who stood up and gave one of the most emotional, forceful speeches of her entire career over something that you wouldn't have thought she felt particularly passionately about. Now, we had a little bit of inside information, and it was one of our most read stories this week, actually, as to the reason why Theresa May was feeling particularly aggrieved that day, and perhaps particularly emotional, and wanting to send a strong message and stand up and be strong on that case. And that's because she, we're told, was furious that morning with regard to a completely different matter of a CNN report about Donald Trump's international phone calls. And Theresa May, the British Prime Minister then, was specifically cited as being bullied by Donald Trump saying she was weak on Brexit, saying a lot of things that no doubt some people watching this will probably agree with. But still, Theresa May felt particularly aggrieved and hurt by that article. So I think it's not too far a stretch to say she was looking to move the story on, and suffice to say, by the end of that day, when you typed in Theresa May, you no longer got weak bullied, you got fiery, strong, stands up to government. And I think in terms of PR terms alone, she sort of salvaged her reputation that day.
It's amazing that she's managed to find a competent comms strategy. It's only come about 3 years too late for her. But she did. I thought she was very good. I don't know David Frost's skill set, so I wouldn't have gone in so hard on the appointment. But yeah, we've still got a new cabinet secretary. But one might hope that, given we've now cleared the decade-long constitutional headaches that we've seen, the cabinet secretary, the next cabinet secretary, might have a slightly easier role over the next few years.
That's certainly true, and one of the reasons why is because the Brexit issue is being put to bed, and the people that were agitating for a second referendum were completely defeated. But out of the embers of their second referendum campaign, something new has sprung up, and crucially, it appears to have clung on to all of the data that has been collected over the last 4 years since the referendum. Now, Paul, can you tell us a little bit more about this latest iteration, this fresh front for the same old Remainers?
Well, the new campaign, or the new campaign name, is Democracy Unleashed, and it's from the same organisational embers as, do you remember Stronger In during the referendum in 2016? Then it became Open Britain post that. Then it became People's Vote. Have I missed anything? And now it's called Democracy Unleashed. And it's fighting the elite and the plutocrats. And it's really a wholly owned subsidiary of Roland Rudd, the uber lobbyist who lobbies on behalf of a lot of the big FTSE 100 companies. He lives in a £25 million house, and he controls this campaign. And as far as I can see, it's just an absolute audacious cheek of him to be running on an anti-elite platform. What I think he's aiming for is probably a centrist or a proportional representation type campaign. For people campaigning for democratic reform, it's noticeable that it is a completely undemocratic organisation. We don't know how it's funded, who put the money up, its governance structures, or anything like that. We do know that it's got 500,000 contacts from all the other campaigns that people are involved in. I imagine a lot of people who are getting the emails are probably wondering, is there anywhere to go with this? What is it all about? And unless it has some democratic authenticity, I can't really see it being much more successful than a AstroTurf campaign. It sounds a bit Lib Dem, and the Lib Dems are already struggling, so why would they want another campaign? There is a Lib Dem campaign called Unlock Democracy. So I don't really see that there's a market for whatever Rudd wants to do with this. I suppose he's got the money and he's got the vehicle, so he thought I might as well use it. If Starmer hadn't been elected leader of the Labour Party and it was still in left-wing hands, I could see a purpose. But Starmer is taking the Labour Party in a centrist direction, so I don't really see what mileage this campaign will have.
And certainly it's annoyed quite a few people who were in the original campaign when it was People's Vote. There are lots of people who were on the board of People's Vote, people like James McGrory, Tom Baldwin, I think, who were forced out by Roland Rudd. And I've spoken to some of the lower level people from that campaign who are almost hoping that this new campaign of Roland Rudd fails. So much is the animosity towards his boardroom coup that was carried out in November last year that we covered extensively on the site. Callie, I think you sort of ran down to try and find the people who'd scarpered from the office or something during that time.
Yeah, it was great fun. I think we were told that the Remain staffers who had sort of launched this people's coup against Rudd were hiding out in a cafe in Pimlico, and I spent about half an hour going all around Pimlico trying to find them, to no avail, unfortunately. But they're all off doing various things. I'm just trying to remember, is this the same new Remain campaign that we reported about a week ago have actually moved to leave country? They'd left Westminster and gone up to Leicester.
Off the top of my head, I think there have been a number of changes on their Company's House page. Like there are a number of different. It's quite confusing because there are a number of different organisations behind this campaign. So the front piece is called Democracy Unleashed. And yet you go into the about terms on their website and it says Democracy Unleashed is a campaign of Open Britain, and then Open Britain's contact details are there, and it's all very sort of slimy in terms of who's actually in charge. And of course there's no openness, no actual contact information on their websites apart from being able to unsubscribe from the email, which they have to provide by law. So it's not like they're being open at all as to what this campaign is about, who's behind it, or what it's for. But I think that's probably enough time talking about a dead in the water campaign that should have closed down a very long time ago. Let's not forget the referendum finished more than 4 years ago, and yet here we are still talking about it. So let's go back to ground and let's go local. Because, Paul, we ran several stories this week about the goings-on in Leicester, one of which was quite a sad story, actually. I don't know if you can tell us all about that.
Well, in Leicester, there has been, as we all know, a resurgence of the virus, and it is being blamed on the conditions of work of people in the garment trade. Leicester's famously has for decades, going back to when Indian immigrants came over and started working in the mills, had a active garment trade. Now, Boohoo produce a lot of their goods, the cheap rags that you see heavily advertised. Their other brand names are Pretty Little Girl, Pretty Little Thing, is it? And Nasty Girl. They have worked reasonably. There was a lot of demand for their products because it's mail order and they're heavily advertised. So they worked reasonably consistently through the lockdown period. And there's been a lot of complaints that people who were sick were insisted on coming into work. They insisted on coming to work. The conditions weren't very adequate. Protection and distancing wasn't in place. And it turns out that there has been some suggestion that it's modern slavery, because in January of this year, Andrew Bridgen, who is the neighbouring MP in neighbouring constituency, asked a question in the House of Parliament about the conditions and asked the business secretary to look into whether there are instances of modern slavery. And there's some suggestion that people are being paid a pittance, a couple of pounds an hour, and there's been a lot of exploitation. Not quite sure where this is going, but given it sort of was flagged before even the pandemic took hold, I think that's something that's worth serious investigation and look into. And there's also, I'm not quite clear about this, also some suggestion that it's linked to a lot of corruption in the local political machine. And whose home turf is this? Keith Faz. And there is some suggestion that the factory owners are in league with the local politicians, and that's why they've got away with a lot of this. We'll see what comes out of it. I don't think it's going to come out very well for some people.
No, and well, good on Andrew Bridgen for raising this all those months ago, because it's really only hit the press now, and only really because of coronavirus. So I think he's really to be commended there. But of course, Leicester wasn't only in the news because of this factory and the conditions there. It was also in the news because there was a bit of tension between the city mayor and the government. And originally, when the government said, we're going to have to put you back into lockdown, the city mayor was resistant to this. And we'd been sort of vaguely aware that he'd hit the local press before, and ran a story actually of his remarkable consistency. Because this was a mayor and a man who had broken lockdown twice, that has been officially reported. We've got some inclination it might have been more than that. And so, of course, he'd be resistant of lockdown coming in again, because he didn't really abide by the last one. So this Labour mayor, I suppose, is not to be commended for his cooperation, because that's almost non-existent. He's to be commended for his consistency. And so that's at least something. But no, I think that's probably enough time talking about local politics in Leicester, because of course we've got a story about local politics in Enfield. So Kelky, what's going on in Enfield?
Yeah, Enfield Council facing sort of financial Armageddon off the back of lockdown, like most local authorities. thought it was a good time this week to award themselves some pretty large pay rises of up to £7,608. The so-called cash-strapped council voted this week to approve the amendment to the special responsibility allowances. Labour entirely off the back of Labour votes, with only 2 Labour councillors abstaining on that vote, to a total of 36 grand. And it's not surprising at all that we've seen the leader of the council and the financial minister or whatever they're called complaining about the tough time the council finances are facing at the moment, before going out and proposing this pay rise, which is not just bad politics, it's appalling handling of finances.
The government is slamming in a lot of cash, billions and billions, into local councils to help them cope with the effects of the pandemic. And I saw that the Taxpayers Alliance put out something saying, at the very least, this should be ring-fenced for new and necessary spending, not to give the senior councillors a £7,600 pay rise. I mean, around the world, you've seen politicians set an example by taking a pay cut. They should really be ashamed of themselves in Enfield, and I hope they pay the price at the ballot box the next time.
It's not the first story about Enfield we've run during lockdown, because I was reminded today that about a month ago we had a story that Labour had also basically sent an email round going, councillors are able to get tested, make sure you go out and get tested before key workers take up all the coronavirus tests, and that was sent by the official sort of local Labour whip. So pay rises and nicking the tests ahead of key workers, they've really showered themselves in glory during this pandemic.
That's remarkable. Well, let's take a step away from the Labour Party now and step towards an even further left organisation called Momentum. And we reported this week on their internal elections. Yes, the faction has factions within that faction in order to try and push the Labour Party, which really itself is a faction of politics, in a further left direction. And the ironically named Momentum Renewal slate in that election, which is actually the old people that were running it. So Renewal is the sort of Landsmanite old faction. We're up against Forward Momentum, which are the people that think Momentum itself isn't internally democratic enough, and were upset about the nomination procedure, for example, with regard to the leadership election within Labour. Now, for Momentum Renewal, the sort of Landsmanite faction, was completely wiped out. Every single elected seat went to a Forward Momentum candidate, and these are the further left people within Momentum. So now that organising committee within Momentum is completely controlled, or at least I think it's 20 out of 24 spaces are now controlled by this even further left faction. So now the question is, how much influence does Momentum actually have over the Labour Party now that sort of their poster girl Rebecca Long-Bailey is out of the shadow cabinet? They might well be sort of just shouting at each other, and in many ways it's quite an entertaining organisation to sort of keep the hard left busy trying to run elections against each other, to run an organisation that doesn't really count for all that much with regard to real Labour politics now.
It's sort of it's become a complete irrelevance, but I've just keeping an eye on it for the many laughs. I think one of my favourite articles during lockdown was when Momentum split and then the new faction called for Unity. It was very Monty Python-esque, but it's now just a sort of creche for Trotskyites and Marxists to play politics with absolutely no consequences, and I think that's very good state of affairs for British politics.
Yeah, fair enough. It's a grown-up NUS. Once you get too old to be a student, i.e. you're sort of 40 years old, because of course there are sort of 35-year-olds running around the NUS still, it's nice for them to have something to do now too. But we're sort of coming to the end of our allotted time slot for Guido Talks now, so I think we'll just round off on a nice, fun story that we ran this week, which is that Tory MPs seem to be being a bit more light-hearted now towards the whole Dominic Cummings saga, which was obviously taking up a lot of their post bags only a couple of months ago. Cowgie, what happened here?
Yes, the local MP, Deanna Davison, the MP for Bishop Auckland, which contains Barnard Castle in it, had a wonderful day out meeting constituents and doing her duties, and popped along to the Specsavers in Barnard Castle for a cheeky photo dig at Dominic Cummings' infamous eyesight test trip. It's good to see the spectators in the town is now open, and you don't need to drive 20 miles as an alternative to checking everything's working.
Well, brilliant. Thank you so much for sticking with us throughout this episode of Guido Talks. Stay safe, enjoy the pubs and the hairdressers today, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.